Right, hello everybody. Today is August the 29th. Mercury has been in retrograde as it's just stationed direct. And at the same time, the planet Venus has just ingressed into Libra. We have just been going through a particularly heavy-duty T-square in the mutable signs. And while Venus has just left this T-square, we still have Mars in Gemini making a square to Neptune. And so what happened is I made some videos on the T-square while the T-square aspect was really being activated with the Saturn, Jupiter, Venus T-square. And as that moves, it becomes less about Saturn and Jupiter and more about Mars and Neptune, with Mars and Neptune in the later degrees of Gemini and Pisces. And one of the things, with this in mind, one of the things that I have been doing with the planet Neptune has been talking about Neptune's political influence, primarily in relation to communism. Although I think you can use this in such a way where you're not just talking about communism, but left-wing politics in general. And as such, the direction of today's video, of the things that I have in mind to talk about, are all fairly political. And they're also, I am a Canadian, and I'm mainly focused on Canadian politics. And I've been navigating this thing about like trying to decide how I'm going to do this channel, about whether I'm going to be political or not political, or talk about my private life, or or how much I'm going to talk about this thing or that thing. The kind of the stuff going on, I feel like there's a certain necessity to talk about it. And sometimes I have to admit that sometimes I wonder about the channel that I have here, which is an astrology channel, if it would not be better for me to just make some other channel where I can present certain ideas or arguments without being attached to astrology, right? But I'm not doing that. I'm sticking with astrology, and I'm sticking with the this whole thing about looking at the timing of events and looking how it's going with the transits and all that. I mean, so it is what it is. I'm staying with the format as I have. I'm not making any major changes. I actually do tarot cards sometimes, asking about whether it's better to do one or the other. And I don't know if it's because the tarot likes, like, tarot practice and astrology practice are kind of like, family members. They're sympathetic with each other, and maybe the tarot is always sympathetic to me doing astrology, or there's something. It's always, I seem to be guided more in this direction, anyways. But the thing about Neptune, right? You notice the timing of this transit where we had the mutable T-square shifting towards Neptune. There's a square between Mars and Neptune right now, and Venus was just in the T-square before Venus ingressed. And the thing that I noticed about this is, for one thing, here in Canada, a rail strike, that a lot of the Canadian industry moving goods around is done by rail. The Canadian economy is primarily built off of our relationship with the United States, and so the Canadian rail strike not only impacts Canada but also the United States. And the whole idea of left-wing politics is that when the workers are working jobs that are essential in this way, they have a lot of leveraging power, because if the workers go on strike at a level that is that fundamental to the Canadian economy, they have the power to totally disrupt the whole economy. So they have a lot of leverage. And then the other thing that's going on is that with the challenging economy, of the challenging cost of living, the challenging expenses, where the cost of living has been rising over the past 10 years without stopping, and wages have not caught up, that it's necessary for the workers to strike in order to keep their wages up. It's also just basically, if you look at the history of union movements and the left wing, everything that we have in terms of worker benefits, like getting paid for overtime, getting sick days, getting vacation days, getting maternity leave, every perk the worker has was fought and won by the left wing, right? So it is completely necessary for labor action, for strikes, for the mobility of the workforce to strike or to stand up for themselves, or else the way that this system works is that, I mean, I have a guy on Facebook who runs a leftist page, and he was talking about, like, personally, I've never worked at McDonald's, although I went for a job. I had worked a job where I had a manager, and I kind of related to this, right? That there's something about, like, if you were a manager working for a company, I've never worked in that kind of boss position, but he was saying, if you're managing a McDonald's, the people want you to be very aware of how much money you are spending on your workforce versus how much money you're making off of your, like, you know, your lunch hour rush or whatever, and to be very, very, like, you're not going to be paying any more people for a shift than necessary. So if it's not busy, you have to send people home, right? You have to run on what is the most efficient way to have the fewest number of people working, making the most amount of money, and then also, how do you make these people, how do you get the most labor out of these people with giving them the least amount of benefits, the least amount of pay, the least amount. And so it's really like there's this thing where if you're a boss or a manager, you're in a position where you're really just like squeezing as much value out of your workers as possible. And if the people don't strike, they don't know where the limit is. If they're like, oh, if the workers are okay with this, let's see if we can get more out of them. If they're okay with this, let's see. So they're just going to put, like, you have to know. And I think there's something about, like, Saturn and Neptune and Pisces, which I'm using. If you look, I'm just using this as the socialist or communist kind of extreme left signifier, because the Russian Revolution happened under a Saturn-Neptune alignment, and there's something about Saturn being the limit, the hard limit, where the workers say they've had enough, and they're going to shut the whole thing down unless things change for the better, basically, right? And so what's kind of interesting is that there's a sort of, like, unevenness. Because, so on one hand, this thing is happening in the news with the rail strike, where there's some action happening around this in that area. On the other hand, as a Canadian citizen looking at what's happening in Canadian politics, one of the things that I've been noticing is the erosion of the center, which there has been a dramatic turn of events in that the BC United, right, which used to be the Liberal Party, the Liberals decided to rebrand because the whole idea of liberalism is just not cool anymore. And this could be because of the association with Justin Trudeau and the rousing of a lot of sentiment against Trudeau, with, you know, guys with big "fuck Trudeau" stickers on the back of their pickup trucks and stuff like that. And it could just be that, like, there's been a lot of mobilization against Trudeau on the federal level, and that the provincial level, the provincial Liberals were never the same as the federal Liberals. They were actually always the federal Liberals have always been more centrist than the BC Liberals, and the BC Liberals have always been a little bit more right-wing. But the whole brand image of the BC Liberals, they used to have a firm grip on power in BC, from, like, Christy Clark to the years before. They had they had their power locked down, and then for some reason the liberal brand name has just fallen out of favor. They changed their name to BC United, and it's been announced just the other day that the BC United are dropping out of the race, meaning that there is the center. The whole pretense of having a political center in BC has completely eroded and given out, and now we're walking into a provincial election where it's the left-wing NDP versus the right-wing BC Conservatives, who, the BC Conservatives were never very popular because the Liberal Party was taking this, what the real Liberal Party previously was holding the power with a kind of with that branding of being centrist but kind of being right-wing centrists, and now they're just not there anymore. The pro pretense of political centrism has just eroded, fallen apart, and now it's just you're either left-wing or you're right-wing. These are your only options. And what's also interesting about this kind of party politics not just in BC but in North America or in the world in general, is that there is a very predictable way where you can predict, you can determine which riding is going to vote left-wing or right-wing, and it's basically the urban centers are always more left-wing and the rural areas are always more right-wing. To the extent where if you unless you live in an urban center, and if you're a leftist and you don't live in an urban center, there's basically no real point in voting because you're a lone leftist in a sea of conservatives, and you can show. I mean, no, I shouldn't say that, because if you do vote, even if you don't have a chance of hell of your candidate getting in, by showing up and voting, it still registers in the system that these people have some meager amount of support and that there's some basis for funding and trying to build a campaign. But as is to be a leftist is to basically feel like unless you are living in downtown, you are basically isolated from all your other fellow people who have the same political views as you, and you feel kind of lonely. And the problem too is there's a certain social problem where there's a lot of leftist infighting. So it's even if you do meet the other leftists, because you agree on you probably vote for the same person, you could agree with all the political things, but have stupid personality conflicts and not get along with each other. But there's some kind of to be a leftist is not easy, right? And despite the fact that people think that the leftists hold this big power hegemony, we've won and we're the majority now, it really doesn't feel that way socially, anyways, right? Maybe I'm getting a bit off track here, but these two things it timed up totally with Mercury stationing direct. The BC United, previously the BC Liberals, folding completely on the election. And the other thing is that it's not looking very good for the BC NDP, because there have been certain BC NDP politicians who have jumped ship to go all the way from the left-wing party to the right-wing party, and these politicians are accusing the BC NDP of being not representing the working class, but rather being political extremists. And they don't really say why, but it's pretty obvious that the reason why they're being accused, so many people are jumping ship of the other thing, is basically the culture war around gender politics, transgender identity politics, stuff like that, and the focus on those issues rather than supporting the working class. Although I don't necessarily think the conservatives are going to support the working class either. However, and this is what it kind of gets into this problem where I think a lot of it has to do more with the belonging to an in-group or in-group identifications rather than coherent politics, or at least in I don't know. When I was living in the city, there was a lot of things if that's the crowd that you're in, if you're going to parties and you're I'm socializing, I'm going to a party, and all the people around are like freaky trans people and lesbians and immigrants from other countries, and it's a really multicultural scene, and you got all these people. It's like that is kind of what people think of as like a left-wing environment. But if if you've never done that, and all you do is like hang out in the country and like go like, you know, shooting your guns and driving your pickup trucks and all this kind of stuff, you don't have the same like life experience of like, oh hey, I like, you know, I work at a place where I have a lot of like multicultural immigrants as friends. Oh, I mean, there's something where I'm going with this, right? There's another issue relating to all this thing about like the conservatives in the rural areas and the left wingers in the urban areas and the multiculturalism and diversity and all this kind of stuff. There's some other issue that's coming up around all this, around temporary migrant foreign workers in Canada. And the thing is, these people are apparently not just working on farms and stuff like that, but they're also working in like fast food and stuff like this, right? And there has been last year, the United Nations warned people about this being conditions for something that's like modern slavery, right? And so it took a whole year for this to like make its way into the news cycle and become politicized as an issue. And just recently the Trudeau government has decided to reel back the amount of temporary foreign workers, which is kind of interesting because it's something that we've had. One of the things that happened was that when COVID hit, we had temporary foreign workers, and they basically just sort of like dialed it up, being like, let's just let more of these people in, let more of these people fill more of these jobs. And I don't know if it has anything directly to do with, well, it obviously has something to do with COVID and the economic impacts of COVID. But there's something about like, I know that I had a lot of friends that I kind of, it's a touchy subject, the whole thing about anti-vax stuff, because personally I got sick myself after taking the vaccine. I don't know if the vaccine caused me to become sick. I'm actually fairly open-minded to that conversation, that maybe vaccines aren't that great. Maybe the vaccine contributed to me having health problems, right? I'm a little bit more ambiguous about it. I don't feel like getting totally on board the RFK Jr. train, but I'm at least not completely shut off to some of those ideas, right? But there's whole things that there are a lot of people that who were working, who didn't want, like, they were demanded that in order to work their job, they'd have to get a vaccine to keep their job. And then there's a certain kind of leveraging where you're like, well, you know, if you don't want to work your job, there's a whole bunch of temporary migrant workers that'll work your job instead, right? And so there's this whole kind of issue about like, I don't see that really getting, if that's a factor or not, but there's something about, based on the people that I know and I talk to, or that around the whole COVID thing, to me that seems like it could be a factor. There's something, about the temporary foreign workers in that it's seen as exploitation, right? Because the people, like, I don't know. Let me just like, there's something kind of funny about this, because there's a, I live in a farming and fishing community, and I moved back here from Nanaimo in 2021, and there's a very different feeling of living in Nanaimo to living in the community where I live, right? And one of the things that I notice as a primary difference of just like hanging out in the neighborhood of Nanaimo, there's a lot more poverty and crime and stuff like that, but there's this basic level of like, there's a certain type of person on Vancouver Island that is kind of like not trying to be too judgmental, but basically a redneck, right? There's a lot of kind of like trailer park boys, redneck kind of types on the island. And then if you compare that to living in where I live, there's it seems a little bit like this sort of like country farmer image, but what you notice is that there are a lot of like vehicles like that are, let's say, like, what can I say, like the Denali's, right? Like the Toyota Tundras that are like, if you're in the market to buy a pickup truck and you're looking at how much these things cost, they're like $100,000 or something like that, at least. I don't know about how many add-ons or stuff, but they're really big, expensive trucks, right? And it's sort of like but if you end up hanging out with the people who are like in maybe even more, like, I don't know, the whole thing about rural and urban is kind of maybe like, rural isn't just like how far away you are from the city. Rural is like having farmland around that that is zoned for farming, not zoned for urban stuff, right? And the rural stuff could actually be fairly close to the city. And the whole idea of rural areas in general is that you've got a large population in the city and that you have farms there to provide food for this huge population of people in the city. And there's some kind of like there's a great video on this by a YouTuber called PhilosophyTube, which I will link in the comments below, and they discuss the problem in the PhilosophyTube channel, right? About how there's a certain kind of like air of moralism of being like the good old down home country, like we're the farmers who are like the backbone of like providing like that. But like if you actually look at what's going on, like I see these people, like I go to I go to my vitamin store to buy supplements, and I see the truck parked outside the vitamin store. That's one of these, like, probably a really expensive truck with like painted on the side like no carbon tax. No, the liberals are trying to enslave us. Fuck Trudeau. Like, we're gonna pay all this money over carbon. And then like at the same time, if you go for a walk around the actual urban areas, what you will notice is that you will notice migrant workers who are either Mexican or probably from somewhere in South America, as well as we also have a lot of Indian workers. And if you notice, you'll see things like a bus full of migrant Indian workers, right? There's like a coach bus, and it's just full of Indian guys. Or there's the South American guys will be riding bikes around, right? And it's sort of like there's this idea of like what you're talking about with exploitation, right? Where if you are a white Canadian guy, you have this idea of what your standard of living is, and you've got a lot of these really loud, angry white Canadian guys who are driving trucks that probably cost $100,000 or more, that are living in houses that have 3-car garages, that probably have multiple vehicles, that are like, I don't know how I'm going to afford this, right? And if you look at the productive workforce that's actually doing the labor, you've got a bunch of Mexican guys riding bicycles around, not spending any money on vehicle costs at all, or else you have a bunch of Indian guys who are all cramming inside of a coach bus, and they're not paying, they're not paying for this kind of stuff. And so these people have, and then there's something about the whole practice of capitalism and exploitation, which is similar to like the whole problem about like clothing, right? Being like where if it's nearly impossible to buy clothes that are made in Canada or made in America. There may be some exceptions to the rule, and I know there's some brands like Patagonia or whatever that have a better ethical ranking than others, right? But in general, if you want to buy clothes, you're going to buy clothes from a sweatshop in wherever, Vietnam, in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in all these third world countries where there are people working these jobs that people probably wouldn't want to work here, and that they're getting paid. It's profitable because you don't have to pay these people very much money, and then you can sell somebody a sneaker for $300 and make a lot of money off of it, right? And then there's this other No, and we're just used to that, right? And what I find interesting is that when the economy gets really expensive, and when the gas prices are through the roof, when the housing prices are through the roof, if you want to go and buy a pair of Nikes have never been cheaper. I bought a pair of Nikes recently. It's the cheapest pair of Nikes I ever bought. The Nikes are dirt cheap. The people in the sweatshop are not making any money off this, right? And then, but like in the same, like food is really expensive. Food is like super, the price of food keeps going through the roof, right? And if you look at the people actually putting the labor in to produce our food, they are not, instead of spending their money on oil and gas, on big expensive pickup trucks, on like houses that have 3-car garages, all this kind of stuff, these people are living very frugal, modest lives, riding bicycles around, living in housing that's probably very minimal. That is, oftentimes they might just have trailers set up on the farms so that these guys can just like live out of a trailer, work, and like they're not living in a fancy house, like they're not competing for the same rental market. You end up getting this sort of situation where I have to say, like, from a social point of view, it feels a little bit like alien, because as a white Canadian guy, you're living a very different kind of lifestyle from these guys who are like, there's this kind of thing where, like, if you don't have a car as a white Canadian guy, you feel like you're doing something wrong. Like all your white Canadian friends all drive cars and trucks, and they couldn't even think about how is it possible to live in Canada without a car or a vehicle. And because I can't imagine how to do this, I am also like, there's only one way to do it, which is spend all this money on my vehicle, and this is breaking me financially, and fuck Trudeau. I have so much resentment for the government because they're the one doing this to me. And then meanwhile, I feel so sorry for these poor workers because they're being exploited, because they're living under this, it's called they're basically accusing it of slavery because they are living in this is what Deleuze and Guattari would talk about, like segments, right? A segmented society where there is it's almost like, like apartheid or something, where you have all these other people living a different kind of lifestyle with a different kind of standard, and they are not spending the money on all these things which prop up the white man's Western identity. Instead, what they're doing is they're taking that money and sending it back to their own communities. And people are saying, like, the whole thing about economic growth or whatever, like, this is not good for our economy, because instead of this money getting put back into the Canadian economy, it's getting sent back to another country, which, if you look at the other country, it's like, well, if we set up sweatshops in this other country, is it good for that country? Is it good to give people a sweatshop so that they have a job, even though you're exploiting them as much as you possibly can, to really just squeeze? Like, how much can you make these people work and then take their product and sell it at a really high price and make as much profit as possible? That whole process is called capitalism. How to do things at as much profit as you can without and really just squeezing the labor, right? Now, the whole thing about there's a certain issue with all this stuff where in your treating the people as just like poor, exploited people, and not like having no ability to emphasize what it might be like from their perspective, or like this basic like what does it mean to be a free person versus to be a slave, or to be somebody who's an indentured worker? Does freedom mean that you have options? you have a choice. You're not just forced into something. You can do a whole number of different things if you want to, right? But the thing is, if you're working a job, trying to make ends meet, trying to pay the bills, do you really feel like you can just be like, oh, well, I could easily just take another job. I could easily just quit this, go and do something else, and like I'm so being really flexible to just do a whole bunch of things? Or do you feel like there's not really much choice? I just have to stick it out to do this thing and put my nose to the grind in order to survive, right? I think a lot of working class people don't necessarily feel like they have a lot of options, right? That you're just kind of like, you fit in wherever you fit in, and you just have to make that work, right? There's something about this though where it's like, I posted, this may not be very popular because I posted this on Facebook, but I didn't get any reaction to it, and maybe it would just confuse people. But I recommend this book, and I'm not going to do a whole book review of it or a whole analysis of it, but there's enough good stuff in this book that it's worthwhile. I don't know if I agree with everything, but it's not really a matter of agreeing or disagreeing. There's something about what this book, it's a good book to just take in and see what you make of it, right? And so they're talking about, like, in this chapter he's talking about global financial instability and economic depressions and all this kind of stuff, and what he has to say about the whole temporary migrant worker thing, right? I'll just read this part. We might perceive through all of the massive economic upheavals of recent decades a few small islands of sustainability and stable growth linked to one thing. No, it's not gold, it's extended family. The third world's remittance economy, which is basically the money sent home by people who have migrated to first world nations, and which rivals international aid in scope, did not crash during the last financial crisis. In fact, in many instances, it grew, baffling economists. These masses of desperately poor people working away from home to continue to send billions of dollars back to their extended families and communities, and this economic process turns out to be resistant to contraction. Maybe I'll just read a bit more of this. Meanwhile, in France and Germany, some aspects of the economy relating to extended families also remain stable, just as they've managed to do through 2 world wars and the collapse of European empires. This is due to the communal property ownership laws that do not exist in the globalizing system of the Anglosphere. French and German extended families are able to hold capital collectively and run mid-sized family businesses without any individual nominally owning and controlling it all. These form permanent intergenerational estates. They work together with diverse portfolios and pool multiple incomes to ensure their eggs are never all in one basket. They provide an internal welfare safety net for each other as protection against the random incidences of austerity and upheaval. Perhaps Australia, this guy's an Australian, perhaps Australia and other countries could begin depression-proofing its economy by introducing extended family property ownership laws and incentives. As a bonus, this may also ease the welfare burden and decrease unemployment. If we're uncertain that such a model might look like, we're waiting for consultants from Australia's Asian community, which seems to already be operating on an informal economy based on extended family models. Or we could just ask one of my grannies. So there's this whole thing about for me there's this multiple part of this where I have to admit that there's also kind of funny the resonance of it, because I went to Australia for 1 year as a young man on a working holiday visa, and which, if you look at this, it's kind of similar, because I was granted the right to live in a foreign country for a year under the pretense, and also the ability to work in that country However, it was a bit of a different pretense because Australia and Canada's economies are very similar. And this is because Australia's economy is largely based on trade with China, and Canada's economy is largely based on trade with America. They're both colonial countries with the same kind of similar kinds of resource-based economies, all this kind of stuff. The thing is, when the countries are so similar in their culture and their economy and all this kind of stuff, it's more of like a one-to-one thing, right? So it's like by me going, I have to admit that I was not there making tons of money and sending it back home to Canada. I was working a little bit, but mainly just kind of like goofing around and getting into trouble, and most of the people who I met in Australia kind of understood that I was there kind of to have a good time or to hang out, and it wasn't it wasn't there just to be seriously economically productive, right? Now, the thing about, like, if you compare something to temporary foreign workers from what you might refer to as third world, or at least not at, these industrial capitalist superpowers, what you have to understand about capitalism is that capitalism needs to have an externality, right, in order to work. Whereas if you look at the way that capitalism started, you had companies like the Dutch East India Trading Company that said you have people in another country who have a certain kind of commodity. If you look at stuff like India, you could have spices, you could have tea, you could have different fruits like oranges and stuff like that. And there's a business opportunity here to have, based on our local economy, there's an economy external to that, and that we can, if people invest in our company, we can then take that money to fuel our boats to go to India, to go and spend things on things that are relatively cheap in another country, and then take that back and sell it at a profit to people in our country, right? And capitalism does not work unless you have an externality of some person who's getting exploited for the sake of profit. That's how capitalism works, right? And the whole idea is that, like, after exploiting these economies of poor countries, there is a kind of a reciprocal give and take where these other countries, when we're going through an economic depression, when we crank up the dial on temporary migrant workers, and while the one side of the coin, these rich, affluent, Western, white countries are experiencing, we're experiencing a shrinking or a loss of GDP, a loss of economic productivity, a loss of profit, and also how much of our industry is based on speculation, right? Like people being like, oh, let's invest all this money in tech and AI because maybe in the future these new technologies will be able to make us a lot of money. In the same way that we would give a lot of money to the Dutch East India Company to go bring us tea and spices, we're going to give all these tech bros a bunch of money so that they'll give us AI and stuff like that, and then that we can make money off of that, and once it's more developed or something, right? And then this crashes when you're like, well, we haven't figured out a way to make money off of this yet. Like, it's not as profitable as what the money we're putting into it, right? Meanwhile, we all have to eat, and the people who are we're all busy doing this tech bro stuff, the people that are just doing the unglamorous working on the farm, and our tech bro economy is crashing and burning, there's a kind of a seesaw effect where the people that are doing the honest hard work on the farm, and also instead of taking all that money and spending it on big fucking $100,000 Denali's and gas guzzling SUVs and all this, and having all this resentment to like Trudeau for because the gas is expensive, these people are just riding little bicycles around and taking all of their money and sending it back to their family in their country, and this is resistant to economic depression. But these people are actually doing what, like the seesaw thing, right? Like once, like all the tech bros aren't doing well, and then these people are actually doing well, right? And the problem is the UN's report is accusing this of slavery, because basically there is a I don't know, is it slavery or is it not slavery? The thing is that these people live in a kind of a segregated community where they're not as integrated with the rest of Canadians, and as such they have a different standard of life, where for these people it's normal. If you're living with a bunch of people who don't have cars that just ride bikes around, it doesn't feel like, you are an alien, that you are some weirdo who doesn't have a car, that you are within your community, it's considered normal. And you're with a bunch of other people that are living a way that is normal, and you are actually being resistant to economic depression, and your family is benefiting from this, right? And the problem about this is that they're saying that these people are, subject to sexual abuse or that the employers have a power imbalance, where the employers have a lot of power over these people because you have to do what the employer says or else they'll fire you, and you can't get a job anywhere else because you're only stuck in this one kind of, you're segregated off from the economy that all the locals are participating in, right? But this other economy is actually doing well, and you're actually making money and sending it back that's kind of balancing out all the exploitation, right? Like you're actually, you're being exploited, but you're actually making money off of this, right? And then the whole question is like, if I'm living in Vancouver and I'm specialized, if I'm specialized, trained to work a certain technical job where there's one like machine that I've trained to like be an expert on this one machine, and that if I was going to work another job, I'd have to retrain. And so because I've invested all this money in training towards one specialization, and then there's one employer in town that specializes, and it's sort of like, isn't it kind of the same thing where if you're really specialized and if you don't get along with your employer, they just fire you and be like, well, where else are you going to work? Isn't that kind of the same thing? And then if the economy is so fucked that you can't, like, you're going to be like, oh, well, I gotta make, adjustments to my, about what I'm spending my money on to be able to cope with this high cost of living. And so, like, maybe there's all these other people who think, like, having $100,000 pickup truck is what they're entitled to, and I'm just going to live with public transit and put up with it, and like, and yet I don't really have a choice because, like, if I got another, like, what if I'm specialized, there's only one thing I can do and I don't have any options, and it's, it's like, it's kind of the same thing. What makes one thing slavery? What makes the other thing not slavery? Or even the language where we say everyone has a right to work. Well, do they have a right not to work? No, you are forced to work whether you want to or you don't. So what about, and so these, like, the whole addressing, there's a criticism, anyways, around the migrant workers, where it's like, that what Canada has done is that we cranked up the knob when COVID happened, and then after cranking up the knob, this industry is extracting a lot of profit from the economy and sending it back to their poor third world country. Like, what we're not actually making the conditions for these workers better. We're just we're basically, half these people are now out of a job. We're basically saying we're just not going to do this as much. But the people who are still working these jobs, we're not going to actually do anything to make it better for them. We're just going to hire less of them. And then we're going to assume that, like, because we're hiring less of them, then maybe, like, some Canadians who can't find jobs are going to, like, decide to, like, work, But it's probably not, like, this whole thing is, if you are a person who's acclimatized to, like, living in the kind of lifestyle that white Western Canadian people live, you're probably not going to get a job where everybody else is, like, living this completely other cultural, like, maybe all your coworkers don't even speak English. They're just a bunch of, what are you going to do? Get on the bus and you're, like, the only white guy with a bunch of Indian people that don't speak, they're completely foreign to you. Like, you're probably gonna, like, even if you are not, it's not, even if you are well-intentioned and not racist and want to embrace multiculturalism, I'm willing to bet you're probably going to not feel very comfortable in that situation, feel kind of like a fish out of water, or, like, like, you want to be in a place where you have some sort of sense of being a peer with the people you're working with. There's a chance that people are not going to work these jobs based on it just being kind of awkward, and there being a kind of a culture divide based on this sort of sense of segregation that we are associating with, like, it's slavery or indentured work or something like that, right? Um, and like, what am I trying to say? There's an externality there, right? The capitalism cannot function without these externalities, and like, we're not doing anything to actually make the conditions for these people working these jobs better. We're just giving less of these people jobs, basically, right? We're just turning the dial down, and there's something about this whole mess where we've got, though people are saying that it's like eroding the it's eroding the Canadian standards, right? Because there's all these people who are unemployed and they can't compete because there's all these other people who are like temporary foreign workers who are just going to work all the jobs that people don't want to work, and there's with Neptune. And it's also kind of funny because, like, now we've got this thing where the center, the liberal center where I live, is completely given out. And now it's just this extreme polarization between the left wing and the right wing. And the people that are moving over to the right wing aren't really addressing the issues around labor. They're more concerned about what people are doing with their genitals, whether they're transitioning or not, right? Like, and with people who make up a very small fraction of society, like this kind of culture war, or like it's the same, like, without kind of being kind of illiterate to the actual economic problems that we're dealing with. And one of the things that I find interesting is that I noticed that there are a bunch of right wing or people that I associate, like, internet pundits who were talking about this problem of the UN, the conditions for slavery. And I've noticed, I try to look for these videos and they're not even, you can't even find them. People are recording stuff where they're talking about this and they've taken it all down, right? I'm kind of wondering what's the motivation for saying something and then taking it down, or withdrawing your comment or something like that, right? But, like, I think, I don't know, this is all basically on my mind with the recent transits anyways. I don't know, maybe I'm getting kind of worked up, maybe I'm I've kind of, like, okay, maybe I should just end here because I've kind of had the certain, like, flow of momentum. I mean, I had some other ideas too of things I could get into, but they're kind of like, they feel pretty, like, far flung in topically in different directions than the conversation that I was going in around these Canadian political issues. Mainly these are labor issues, right? And the potential for striking versus the idea of indentured workers who are not going to strike, who are putting up with conditions that there's the class segregations, right, of a certain class of Canadians who have a certain expectation for a certain kind of lifestyle, and the way that capitalism is designed to rely on some externality that it exploits, right? And the externality could be in the form of foreign labor that has or a foreign market where there are different commodities that are available, or the externality of resources, right? That you're pulling stuff up from the earth that you didn't put there. You're putting the effort into extracting it, but you're not the one who, you didn't create oil or minerals or wood out of your own effort. You're just the one extracting it, right? And the same way that you're, like, you're maybe not the one who is putting the work into doing your food production, but you still have the ability to extract value off these people who you consider to be an externality to your system, right? And then there's this whole the other conversation about like the rise. It's kind of depressing because there's such a rise in right-wing sentiments which are basically anti-multiculturalism, anti-immigrant, and basically it's not, there's something about like a Hegelian dialectic where you try to mitigate, like in a situation where things seem so polarized, if you're going to do anything to actually make a headway for your cause, you want to find a way where you can convert the other people over to your side, right? And as a leftist right now, it's not looking very good, because the problem is, rather than like being able to have a way where people like Slavoj Žižek are good examples of this, because they're the kinds of guys who identify as leftists but will go on right-wing conservative talk shows and talk to conservatives about the leftist argument, right? Being in such a way that, like, if you are so polarized against other people that you can't even sit down and have a conversation, you don't have any way to make any progress, make any headroom to win people over your cause at all, right? And it's become this situation where it's necessary. I sometimes question about, I'm doing an astrology video, but I have to admit I'm spending all the time talking about politics, but it has to do with these Neptune aspects and how I've associated Saturn-Neptune with communism and left-wing principles, right? That I sometimes hesitate. I'm hesitant to just go and make a political channel or to make an influencer channel where I just talk about my these opinions and stuff. But like, it is this thing where, like, I live with my mother and my sister, but I used to think that I could at least with my mother was like politically literate and you'd be able to like have a conversation with her or whatever. But it's turning more and more into this situation where it's like the straw man. There's this idea of like straw manning versus steel manning, which is one that I've heard people talk. It's like an idea that's got some traction recently. I've never heard of steel manning before until recently, right? That you can like take somebody who has a different position of you, and you can try to bridge the gap and create a sort of kind of empathy by making good assumptions or whatever, right? Or trying to see how there may be some sort of positive, or not just painting your opponent out to be coming from a really bad place, right? Where you can like, and I think there's something about this where like I have to admit that I have a challenge with in online spaces around the New Age. That I had a lot, because around politics, because I had a lot of New Age kind of friends that in the post-COVID years went really right-wing, right? Like, I had one friend that I thought was pretty cool, but that view of this person honestly changed around the time they started sending me videos with Ben Shapiro in them, right? It kind of is like, oh, I kind of thought this person was cool, but if you like Ben Shapiro, I don't think you're very cool. That's just kind of like how my, how I'm oriented, right? But if I sit down with my family, there's certain things of like, you got to watch out for those right-wingers because they think that, 5G gives you COVID. But then the whole problem is like, I had, like, when you're dealing with weird New Agers, some of them are really wacky and far out. And it's sort of like, there's something if you're dealing with somebody who's really wacky and far out, rather than being like, what a bunch of fucking morons. They think 5G, like, I can't believe these people are such idiots. How, like, you're not going to win anybody over your side if you treat them like that, right? But instead you can be like, okay, wait, maybe 5G doesn't cause COVID, and maybe these people are a little bit wacky, but you can still, if you are you're more empathetic, you could say, wait a minute, maybe there is like maybe there's an expression of a concern of like living in such a media saturated environment that, or the idea of having electromagnetic radiation, like maybe electromagnetic radiation does affect our health in some way. Maybe that's not the same as it being the thing that causes COVID, but like you could take somebody who seems a bit weird, seems a bit far out, seems a bit like foreign to you, and you could bridge that gap by being sympathetic to their concern, by saying like, yeah, I don't know if I agree exactly with what you're saying, but you know, we could maybe like try to, you could try to like, you know, coax them into maybe a bit of a better direction with it, or like maybe there are environmental concerns around certain technologies and certain industries, and we want to make sure that your concerns are sympathized with. You don't want to feel like the people electing a government think you're an idiot and don't take any of your concerns seriously, right? But yet, like, with the way my family works, it's sort of like, it feels like it's becoming more and more the situation where you're like, well, I'm right and everybody else is wrong and they're just stupid. And, you know, and and anything I don't agree with, I hide from my news feed. So all I get is just things telling me about how I'm right. And then if you try to present anything that sounds like a different opinion, I just don't know how to react to that. Because all I do is I just sit there and have things fed to me about like how I'm right and that reinforce my point of view, and how these other people are just a bunch of fucking morons, right? And then it's sort of the situation where you're like, well, you know, how am I, if these people make up a good degree of our community, and we are getting more and more and more in just being hedged into our own beliefs and our own opinions, it kind of feels like if I want to act, you know, not just be isolated, feeling in this frustrating situation where I don't know anybody in my community, I don't know any friends, and everybody in my community is going to vote right wing. If I go to the bar and start talking to people, I want to be able to be at least have the space to be able to like talk to my neighbors or talk to my community, or to have some degree of like, you know, people can have a different opinion and you can still sit down and have a chat with them and have that kind of openness, or have a kind of, you can still have a sort of sense of belonging to a community, but not, maybe people have different opinions or people have different ideas about what you should do, but that doesn't mean you just hate each other, or that doesn't mean that as soon as somebody opens their mouth, you're like, that person's an idiot, I'm not going to listen. But this is the whole thing about the polarization, where it feels like we're but at the same time, I'm not going to be my own desire to have a sense of connection or to my community and the people around me. I'm not going to turn that into like, oh, I'm being converted to the right wing, or I'm being converted to and it's really, that's not the case. I think it's better for me to be just honest and say, like, I mean, there's no reason why not to be a left winger, to go in there, vote for the NDP, not complicate things. But there's a certain there's a certain, if you listen to people who are like political pundits, and you're like, there's a certain guy who has a channel for like Canadian politics, and he's just basically arguing the party line for the left wing or the NDP. It's not that I necessarily disagree with it, but if I had the way you know, it's like if your whole conversation just has to be like towing the line to like, it's just, I don't know, and that's not what I'm gonna do, right? It's not what. It's not the way my mind works. I don't. It feels like being stuck in a box that is just not very inspiring, or is a bit played out, or is not like, seems to be somehow kind of it's like deaf to understanding the other side of the story, right? It's deaf to understanding why not everybody is on board with it. It's not really addressing the problem of why so many people are getting pushed in the other direction, right? And the more you just have a condescending attitude towards people who think differently from you, I don't know. I'm like, it's like, I'm just, you know, I'm taking it, I'm using this as a means to have some kind of expression where I don't feel like completely silenced or just completely squashed by having, like you can't say anything unless it can I don't know. It's just a weird time. Or that there's got to be some truth that doesn't fit into these like formulas of like we have one formula versus another formula and everybody has to get on side this one formula so that it wins, and because that's somehow going to solve our country's problems, right? Like I don't have a lot of confidence on that way of approaching things. Or if you're like the idea of just dealing with the truth of the situation, it's a kind of a myopic kind of tunnel vision just to be stuck in that. And like you could easily just step outside that really narrow way of looking at things and see a whole lot of other stuff that doesn't necessarily fit into it, right? I don't know. Maybe this is just a weird ramble. Okay, Mars is squaring Neptune today. I don't know. Hopefully you liked it anyways. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to be making more of these. Stay tuned. Okay. Thank you very much.